on 14b, and we are at, hold on. Okay, we're a little bit in the middle of the Gemara. We'll review it just in a moment and catch up. But we're 17, 18 lines in the top. Last one on the line is V'idach, and that's what we're holding, V'idach. Okay. We were in the middle of a major debate, which was entirely tangential, but it sort of came in. So we said that the Sefer Torah, the scroll, ideally, it's going to be six tefachim tall. I'm sorry. No, 6 tefachim, 18 inches by 6 tefachim in circumference, right? We noted that was extremely difficult to produce, right? One of the Tanam, he commissioned 70 Sefer Torah, and only one of them fit the bill. It's a difficult ratio to get, but then we tried to figure out how do you put it into the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote a Torah scroll, and that Torah scroll was mitzad ha'aron. Mitzad literally means next to the Aron. And we tried to figure out how to fit it in. So we had two opinions. One opinion said there were the 2 tablets, and then adjacent to the tablets was the scroll, the Sefer Torah. And the other opinion was no, the two luchos, the tablets were in the Aron, the scroll was adjacent to the Aron. Either it sat in a box that was filled with 6 golden rats, or it sat on a shelf that protruded from the Aron. Okay. We spoke about how the word mitzad, beside, can either mean adjacent to, as in the shelf or the box, or it can mean next to the luchos, as opposed for it being the luchos being in the scroll being in between the luchos, it was actually beside it. And we spoke about the fact that both sets of luchos, the broken luchos and the second luchos, the second tablets, Moshe Rabbeinu, right, he saw the Jews worshiping the golden calf. He took the tablets and he broke them. The broken tablets were also placed in the ark, and there are 2 separate sources. One of them concluded this from the verse Ein Ba'aron, and the other one said Asher Nikra Shem Hashem. The fact that God's name is written twice indicates to us that the tablets were placed in the ark. However, the opinion that learns the source, the broken tablets were placed in the ark from Ein Ba'aron, what does he do with the verse of Shem? Which names of God were in the Aron that does not refer to the tablets? So that's what we're up to. The Idach. Yomi Bava Batra. There was a Rabbi Shimon Yochai says that God's name and all the secret names of God, all the other words that allude to God, all those names were placed on a paper and placed in the ark. The Idach Nami Bava according to Meir, what's the source? Obviously, Shem refers to the fact that God's names were in the ark, not the broken tablets. So Gemara says, "Enochanami, you're correct." Shivrei luchos, according to Meir, Shivrei luchos menachem ba'aron minalei. How does he know? In other words, Shem, the fact that it says God's name twice, that refers to the actual names of God that were placed in the ark. How do we know the broken tablets were placed in the ark? Minalei. Nafklim mitoni of Yosef, asher shibarta v'samtem. That which you broke and you placed it in the Aron. Those words are adjacent to each other. Right. So the correct way to read the verse is write on the tablets the words that were on the tablets Asher Shibarta that you broke, and then v'samtem ba'aron. So meaning the verse is supposed to be read like this: get new tablets and write the same thing on them. And second thing is the subject and the predicate, right? The predicate of that would be and place them in the ark. What should be placed in the ark? The second tablets that you're about to write. But it could also be read as write the same words on the write the same words on the tablets which you broke and place it in the ark. Meaning that the broken tablets should be placed in the ark. And the other opinion says, what does Asher Shibarta tell us? Yashar karchacha sheshibarta. Moshe Rabbeinu did not consult God before he dropped the tablets. They became too heavy to carry, and he saw the Jewish people were engaged in idol worship, and he dropped them. But God consented to his dropping. God said, and God thanked him, Asher Shibarta, that which you broke, meaning the word Asher is that, but it is also short for Ashrei, as in praiseworthy, meaning he did the right thing by breaking the tablets. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Sidron Shal Neviim. What is the correct order of the canon, the set of canon, which is known as the prophets? It's as follows: Yehoshua Shoftim, Shmuel Umalachim. That's what we have. Yirmiyah, Yecheskel, Yeshaya, Ushnei Masar. And then the 12 smaller books are all put together. So Gemara says Michti. Hoshea Kodem. Hoshea was the first of Yirmiyah and Yecheskel. Tichsiv, as the verse states, Chilas Dvar Hashem b'Hoshea. The first of the four, there were four contemporaries. We'll soon see who they were. But Hoshea was the first of them. Hoshea is the first book of the 12, what we call the Treyasar, the 12 brief prophets. So why is Hoshea last after Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, and Yecheskel when he was first of those four contemporaries? Gemara says, was Hoshea the first prophet? What does it mean? The first word of God was to Hoshea. Was Hoshea the first prophet? There were many prophets. There were 4 prophets at that time, and they were Elohain, Hoshea v'Yeshaya, Amos uMicha. Hoshea was before Yeshaya, and Hoshea was the first of these 4 prophets. Samar says, let Hoshea be first. Samar says, Kim d'chsiv nivuos gabi chagas chari malachi is safe. Because the Treyasar have the end of the Nevi'im as well. Chagas chari malachi are the last generation of Nevi'im. So therefore, we placed his prophecy all the way at the end. The Gemara says, write it on its own, and put it first. The Gemara says, because Hoshea is a relatively speaking smaller book. I believe there's 8 prakim in Hoshea. I believe it was 12, might be 12. But relatively speaking, by the standards of Yirmiyah, Cheskel, and Yeshaya, it's a small book. So therefore, we put it all into one big book, which is the book of 12. What we call the Treyos, the 12 prophets. So Gemara says, let's examine this. Yeshaya, Kodem Yirmiyah, Yecheskel. Yeshaya was prior to Yirmiyah and Yecheskel. Yirmiyah prophesied the destruction. Yeshaya was the generation before Yirmiyah. Yirmiyah was the generation of destruction, and Yecheskel lived after the generation of destruction. Not after, but through it. His book discusses what happened afterwards. So why is Yeshaya after? If you look at the Yeshaya ratio, why isn't Yeshaya before Yirmiyah and Yecheskel? So Gemara says, "Kivan de Malachim Seifei Chorbana." Since the Book of Kings, that's the book that's written at the end. So so we have the canon of prophets, right? We have the 4 early books and the 4 later books. The 4 early books, that would be Yeshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, and Malachim. The 4 later books, this would be what is it? Yirmiyah, Yecheskel, Yeshaya, Treyasar. If you're familiar with the words I'm saying, you prefer the English versions.
No, it's fine.
Okay, got it. Okay, so because the book of Malachim is the end, concludes with leading up to the destruction of the temple, therefore Yirmiyah goes next. Yecheskel, Reish Chorbana v'Seifei. Yirmiyah is a book that entirely discusses tragedy, the destruction. Yecheskel is a book that begins with the destruction, v'Seifei Nechemta, and the conclusion of the book is comfort. Yeshaya Kula Nechemta, and Yeshaya is entirely comfort. So we place it in order, sort of like a emotional chronology, right? It's like the first. So we finish off with leading up to the destruction, and then we go through the destruction. Then we go through a book that's part destruction, part post destruction, and then a book that's comforting. Okay, and that explains the order of the prophets. Now we get to scriptures. So what's in scriptures? You have the 5 Megillas, right? And we also have a few other books, right? We have Tehillim, Mishlei, Divrei Yomim, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. So what's the correct order? So the basic order listed here is mostly chronological. Okay, so we have Rus. Rus obviously is a story that happens in the time of the Shoftim. The story of Rus involves a character named Boaz. Right, Boaz is Itzvan, who is one of the Shoftim. It's a very early book. It happens, maybe 100 to 200 years after the Jewish people enter Israel. Okay. Then you have Seder Tehillim. Who wrote Tehillim? Well, let's rephrase that. Who compiled? We'll see who wrote it soon. Who compiled Tehillim? David HaMelech, King David. Okay. Then you have Eiv. We don't know who wrote Eiv. That's really, today we'll discuss a lot, and tomorrow we'll discuss even more, and perhaps even the next day. Okay, the book of Job is a book of a very righteous man who suffered tremendous tragedy. And we'll get into it. Mishlei. Who wrote Mishlei? King Solomon. He also wrote Kehelas, and he wrote Shir Hashirim. He wrote all three books. Okay, and Rashi points out Shir Hashirim was his last book. That's why it's listed last term. Okay, Kinnis. Kinnis is another word for the book of Lamentations, the Megillah known as Eicha. So that was in Yirmiyah, end of destruction of the first temple. That makes sense, right? Correct order. Then we have Daniel. Daniel lives at the conclusion of the temple and into the post-temple Babylonian experience. So that Daniel is next. Daniel lives at the same time as Megillah Esther. As a matter of fact, the Hasach in the Megillah, according to one opinion, is Daniel. Daniel is actually featured in Megillah Esther as a courier between Esther and Mordechai. So Daniel makes sense. Put Daniel. The next book is Megillah Esther. Okay, that makes sense. Ezra rebuilds the temple, right? So remember, Queen Esther marries King Achashverosh. They have a child who later permits them to rebuild the temple. Darius II, Yavesh Hasheni. Who does Darius II give permission to rebuild the temple? To Ezra. Ezra gathers in the exiles and travels to rebuild the temple. The book of Ezra is the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple. And Divrei Yom is a chronological order from the beginning of time. That would be from Adam, who ate in the garden, to until Ezra's time. Okay. Fine, that's the order. According to the opinion that says that Eiv lived at the time of Maishahaya, okay, so we'll see that there's a number of debates when exactly Job lived. We'll get to it later, hopefully later today. If he lived at the time of Maisha, why isn't it the first book? The Gemara says, we don't want to begin with tragedy. So the Gemara says, Rus Nami Paronasi. Rus is also a book of tragedy, right? So the Gemara says, yeah, Paronas the Isle Achras. Rus is a book of tragedy, but it has a conclusion. There's an Achras, meaning that the book of Rus concludes with a tremendous amount of hope, right? The Yishai Haledas David, the end of that's the last verse of the book of Rus. The Yishai Haledas David, and Yishai gave birth to King David, meaning after all the tragedy that Rus went through, ultimately speaking, the conclusion of the book is a book of hope. It's a book of King David, who's the father, the spiritual father and ancestor of Mashiach. Okay, so that's why Eiv is a book that ends without a long-term hope. And therefore, we don't want to begin with the book of Eiv, of Job. If you don't understand any of the Hebrew words, I can just switch. I'm less familiar with the canon when it gets past Deuteronomy. Okay. Okay, 1 second. Hold on. Okay. The Amr of Rav Yechon said, "Lama nikra shema Rus." Why is the name of the book called Rus? Sheyotzi menu David, because King David is the progenation, the ancestry of King David is listed in the book. He sort of serenaded God with praises and songs. Okay, Umikasfan. Okay, so now is the next question. It's a very important question. It's just who wrote the books? So we went through the books of the cat. Again, let's remember how we got here, right? Broken telephone. How do we get here? We started off with a guy who wrote all 24 books in one scroll, right? The guy died. He had two inheritors. They wanted to cut up the book, cut up the scroll. We said no. And once we're talking about this massive scroll, now we're starting getting into the specifics. Who wrote all the books of the scroll? Okay. So Moshe cuts the Sifrei Uparshas Bilam. Moshe wrote his book and the book of Bilam. Okay, the book of Bilam is actually next week's parsha, right? We have a huge next week's parsha, Parshas Bolak. A very large percentage of the parsha are actually the prophecy of Bilam, not Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, in some context, that section, the prophecy of Bilam, is called Parshas Bilam. So who wrote it? Obviously, Bilam is not the contributor. Not only that, but you have to realize Moshe Rabbeinu was not necessarily present at the time of Bilam's attempted curses, which ended up becoming prophetic visions. So God told him to write it. He wrote the vision of Bilam. Okay. He also wrote the Eiv. He also wrote the book of Job, according to this opinion. Yehoshua Kosav Sifrei Ushmainav Sukkim Shabbat. Yeshua wrote his book and the last 8 verses of the Torah. This is because the last 8 verses discuss the death of Moses. Obviously, we'll soon see the other opinion. But for now, it would seem obvious that Moshe could not write the story of his own death. Okay. Shmuel Kosav Sifrei B'Shoftim. Shmuel, Samuel, he wrote his book, the book of Samuel, and also the book of Shoftim. At that point in time, right? So Samuel, Shmuel, he is the one that anoints Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, to be the king. Eventually, he also anoints King David to be the king, and anoints King David to be the king. So he writes his own book, and he writes the historical history of the Jewish people from when they entered the land until that point. So after Yeshua dies, there's a period of judges. Many different people take over, right? And then it's a sad story. The judge takes over. He leads the people out of suffering and the vicissitudes of life. And then eventually the Jewish people have, 40 years of good or some amount of years of good. And then they fall into idol worship again. They fall into subjugation again, etc. And the cycle repeats itself. We have many different shoftim that redeem the people at that time. Right, we have Gidon and Yiftach and Shimshon and Itzvan, many others. Okay, so who wrote that history? Shmuel wrote it. Okay, V'Rus v'David Kosav Sefer Tehillim. I'm sorry. Shmuel Kosav Sefer v'Shoftim V'Rus. Shmuel also authored the book of Rus, which is the history of King David. David Kosav Sefer Tehillim. David wrote the book of Tehillim. He compiled the book of Tehillim from 10 authors. 10 seniors. Who are these seniors? Adam Arishan, first man, Adam. Malki Tzedek. Malki Tzedek, remember, is the king that helps Avram to victory. Right, he's the king of Salem. Right, later to become Jerusalem, which is a combination of the word Yira and Shalem. So it becomes Jerusalem. And Vaidei Avram also writes some of the chapters. We'll soon see. There's one chapter written by Malki Tzedek. Avram is called Yedusun in Tehillim, in Psalms. The chapter is written by Yedusun. Yedusun is Avram. I'm sorry. Yedusun's later. I'm sorry. Avram is Eitan HaMizrachi. Eitan HaMizrachi. He's the author of some of the Psalms. That is Avram Avinu. Vaidei Moshe. We'll soon see Moshe is Tefillah LaMoshe, the Psalm to Moshe. We say one every Shabbos. Vaidei Haman. A person named Haman. Haman, again, has Psalms authored in his name. We have Vaidei Yedusun. We have Yedusun also. Lametzeach Yedusun. Vaidei Asaf. Who was Asaf? It's a big question who Asaf was. Asaf was certainly an advisor to David named Asaf. He might have also been Avi Asaf, one of the children of Korach. In addition to Vaidei Shlosh b'nei Korach, 3 other children of Korach. Again, Asaf authors, I believe, 11 Psalms. I believe it's 75 to 86. Might be a little more than that. Say which Psalms were written by Asaf?
73 to 83.
73 to 83. Okay, pretty close. 73 to 83. It's 11 Psalms. And then the three children of Korach have a number of psalms listed as Lam Natseach with Nei Korach. The second on Monday, the psalm of the day is one written by the children of Korach. Okay, fine. Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, Kosef Sifrei, he writes the book of Jeremiah. The Sefer Malachim, he also writes the book of Kings, Malachim. The Kinnis, he writes Kinnis. Kinnis again is the word for Eichel, Lamentations, one of the Megillas. Okay, Chizkiah Usiatoi, Chizkiah and his friends, this is Ezekiel, they write the following books: Yeshaya, the book of Isaiah, Mishlei, the book of parables. What is it called? Mishlei. Is it called parables? I think so. Proverbs. I'm sorry, Proverbs. Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs, Kehelas, Ecclesiastes. Okay, Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the great assembly. These are the last prophets. Chag Zechariah Malachi and the next generation of scholars. The first generation of scholars, post prophets. These join in a convocation together with the prophets. This convocation existed for about 100 years during the time of the Second Temple. So they basically seal the canon, and they do this by writing a few books and ending it. Basically locking the canon at the 24 books. And they are Yecheskel, the book of Ezekiel, Shnei Moser, the book of the 12, Daniel, the book of Daniel, Megillas Esther, the book of Esther, Ezra Kosef Sifrei. Ezra writes his own book, the book of Ezra, the Yachas Shel Divrei Hayamim, and he writes the lineage, which is the first half of the book of Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles. Thank you. Adloy until his own history. So the Gemara says, this supports the opinion of Rav. The Amar of Yehudah Rav le'ola Ezra mi Bavel at sheyichas atzmei va'ola. When Ezra left Bavel to go up to Israel, he set a lineage. He examined the lineages of the entire generation until his. So it makes sense that he wrote part of Chronicles that deals with the lineage. Uman Askei, who concluded the book of Ezra and the book of Chronicles, Nehemiah ben Chakaliah, Nehemiah, the student of Ezra. Amar Mar Milon, Yeshua Kosef Sifrei, Yishmael Psukim Shabbatorah. Joshua wrote his own book, the book of Yeshua, Joshua, and also the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy. Tanya Command Amar Shmael Psukim Shabbatorah, Yeshua Kosvan. So this supports the brayso that indicates as such, the Tanya we learned, the Yomas Shamay She'eved Hashem. It's the verse states, last 8 verses of the Torah, Moshe dies, servant of God. So Gemara says, Efsher Moshe Meis Kosav, V'Yomas Shamaysha. Is it possible that Moshe would die and write his own death? How did that happen? Ela Adkan Kosav Moshe. Until that verse, Moshe writes. Bikan Ve'ela Kosav Yeshua. Yeshua writes that. Yeshua writes those last 8 verses.
Knowing that was going to
Get to it. Diver Rabbi Yehudah. It's opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. V'Amrila Rabbi Nechemiah. And some say it's Rabbi Nechemiah's version. Amrila Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, "After Sefer Torah Chosar Isachas, could it be that a scroll will be missing one letter? God says to Moshe, take this scroll. So how could it be that he's taking a scroll that isn't complete? I mean, God says, grab the Sefer Torah. Now let's be very clear here. A Sefer Torah. Let's say I'm writing a scroll, right? So this is typically what happens. They write. It's like 50 folios or something like that. 50 or so folios, and they write 50 folios, and they get to the last, this is 54, 55, somewhere around there. And what they do is the last folio they keep separate, and then they sort of finish it out so everyone can fill in the last letters, and then it's stitched. And then they stitch it together, and then they finish the scroll, because the scroll is not finished until the last folio is stitched together. So how could it be that the last folio is missing 8 verses, and God says to Moshe to take the scroll? Until that point, God dictates to Moshe what to write, and Moshe says it and writes it. From that point onward, God dictates, but Moshe Rabbeinu does not say the words. He simply writes them with tears. What Jules proposed. As the verse says later, one second. Okay, just like Jeremiah dictates to Baruch, his assistant, Baruch ben Uriah, what to write, so too God dictates to Moshe what to write. So Moshe was able to write of his own death. Okay, come on, okay, so now we know that there's such a debate. Let's ask the following question. Okay, these last 8 verses, one does not require a tzibur. He does not require a minion to read those 8 verses. He can read it alone. Generally speaking, we read as a community, but these last 8 verses, even an individual. 1 second, hold on. I'm sorry. I misspoke. Sorry. It gets served as one aliyah, one chapter. You can't divide it up into multiple aliyahs. How do we know that? How do we know it's given as one aliyah? Lema Rabbi Yehudah, like Rabbi Shimon. Let's say this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah, not like Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Yehudah says it was written by somebody else. It was written by Yehoshua, by Joshua. And according to Rabbi Shimon, it's one scroll. It's all written by Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara says, no. I feel Tamer Rabbi Shimon hoyel v'ishtana because Moshe Rabbeinu did not speak after God, and he wrote it in tears, so it's considered its own section, and therefore it should be written as one aliyah. Okay, next, Yeshua Kotz of Sifrei. Say I was once in the old city. There was this tour guide giving a tour to secular but traditional Jews in the old city, and this was like a Christian type of tour guide. So he started talking about Joshua. So I'm sorry. He started talking about Jehoshua, and he lived because in Hebrew it's Yehoshua. So he was mispronouncing the word Joshua as Jehoshua. Oh. And the 2 guys that are giving the tour wanted to know if Joshua and Jehoshua were the same person. The tour guide wasn't sure of the answer. Okay. Yeshua Kasa Sifrei. Yeshua wrote his own book. It says in the book of Joshua, it says that he passed away. So who wrote that? Gemara says the Aske Elozar. Elozar the Kohen, he wrote that section. Gemara says Vaksiv Elozar ben Aaron Kohen Meis. It says that Elozar the Kohen Gadol also died. Gemara says the Aske Pinchas. Pinchas concluded that section. So Yeshua, Joshua actually has 3 authors, right? There's Joshua, Elozar, and Pinchas. Okay, Shmuel Kosef Sifra. Shmuel wrote his own book. Vaksiv Shmuel Meis. Shmuel dies in his own book. The Gemara says the Aski God HaChayza. God the prophet, V'Nasan HaNavi. God the prophet and Nasan the prophet, they conclude the book. David Kotzav Sefer Tehillim, Aidea Sarah Zakanim. David writes Tehillim with 10 elders. Why isn't a Tanha Ezrachi counted? So Amarav Rav says, no. Eitan HaEzrachi, Zehu Avram. This is the same person, Avram. Ksiv Hacha Eitan HaEzrachi, Ksiv Hasam Miher Mi Mizrach Tzedek. Who is the one that brings the light from Mizrach, from the east? That one is Avram. Avram is called Eitan HaEzrachi. The Kachashiv Moshe, Kachashiv Haman. Ba'amar Rav Haman Moshe. We count Moshe as one of the elders, and we also count the person named Haman. But Rav says that Haman is Moshe. Ksiv Hacha Haman Uksiv Hasam B'chol Beisin Naman Hu. Haman means trustworthy. And Moshe Rabbeinu, God specifically says, is trustworthy. He's Naman. So it's the same person. Simon says, no. Trey Haman Hava. There are 2 people whose name is Haman. Moshe Kasa Sifrei Parashas Bilam. V'Yov. Moshe Rabbeinu writes the book, his own book. Those are the 5 books of Torah. He also writes the section of next week's parasha, which is that authored by Bilam. And he writes the book of Job. Okay, we'll soon see there's a major debate about when Job lived and who authored the book of Job. Okay, so clearly this opinion is Messiah Rav Levi Bar Lachma, the Omer of Levi Bar Lachma. Very interesting name, by the way. I don't think I've come across that elsewhere. Eoiv b'mei Moshe Haya. Eoiv lived in the time of Moshe. Ksiv hacha miyitin eifai v'yichtavan mili. Who will give me a space and I'll write my words. Ksiv hasam, and in the Torah it says v'mei yada eifai. Eifai is when I will know that space. Because those words are used in the same place, it indicates that it must have been written in the time of Moshe. The aim of Mei Yitzchak, the Siv Me Eifai Hu Atzad Sayed. Yitzchak also used the word Eifai when Esav comes to him with right, they were supposed to both give gifts to their father, and Yaakov Avinu slyly slid in first, and then Yitzchak finds Esav, and Esav's coming to give him the second gift, and he says, "Who was it that gave me the first gift?" Ephai. Yaakov, maybe it's the time of Yaakov. This is where he instructs, where he instructs Yehudah to go down to Egypt to go collect food. They didn't realize that Joseph was the king at the time. Maybe it was in the time of Yosef. Yosef is looking out to go visit his sons. They're pasturing the sheep. This is, by the way, a very bad idea, right? Eventually, they sold him when he went down, when he went to meet them, but he used the word Ephai. Because in Eiv it indicates that it'll be written in a sefer. Yuchku means it will be like hun. It will be chok. It will be engraved. So who's the engraver? Moshe is the engraver. The portion of the mechayik is hidden. Mechayik here refers to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is the engraver of the tablets, and sort of he engraves the history of the Jewish people's Torah by writing it down. Rava said, okay, so now we get into it. So who wrote Job? When did Job live? Forget about who wrote it. When did he live? So first opinion is he lives in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Rava Amar he lived at the time of the spies. There was a person who lived in the land of Utz. His name was Eiv. When the Meraglim, when the spies were going to spy on Israel, they said, Hayesh ba'etz, is there an eitz? Is there a tree? So eitz and Utz, it's the same person. So the Gemara says, it's a different word. Utz and eitz are not the same word. So the Gemara says, there's a person who lives as long as a tree. He has an exceptionally long lifespan, and he protects his generation like a tree. Who is this man? This man is a reference to Eiv, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu was basically asking the spies, go check on Eiv. Make sure that Eiv will not serve as a protection that his merit should protect the Canaanim, the Canaanite nations, from the Jewish people conquering them when they go to battle. There was this scholar that sat in front of Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, and he said the story of Job never happened. It's a parable. Amar Loi, so Shmuel says to him, no. The fact that the verse states there was a person and his name was Job, it's specifically to remove the possibility that Job is a fictional parable. It was an actual story. So the Gemara says, El miato ulerosh ein kol kim kafs achas katana asher kona v'yichya. Okay, this is a parable that Shmuel relates about a poor person that only has one sheep. Okay, it's clearly a parable. Mihava, did that happen? El Moshe Balamo, Chanami Moshe Balamo. Well, that's another verse that indicates parable. So why is this any different? This entire book could be one parable. So Gemara says, no. Imkain Shmoi v'Shem Ira Lomo. If it was a parable, why do we need to know his name and the name of a city? The name and the name of a city clearly tell us it's not a parable, it's an actual story. They both say Eiv was among those that came up from the exile. Meaning Eiv lived hundreds of years later. He lived after the destruction of the first temple, in the time of the second temple. He left Babylonia. He went to Tiberias, and that's where he had a study hall. So the Gemara says, "Meisvei, question: Eiv lived at the time when the Jewish people entered Egypt until they left Egypt. So clearly he couldn't have lived after Egypt. So Gemara says, no. No, it doesn't mean he lived then. It means he lived 210 years. Like the amount of time the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt. Meisvei. Shiva Nevi'im Nisnavel Umas Island. There were 7 prophets to the non-Jews. And these are they. Bilam, Eiv. Eiv is a non-Jewish prophet here. I'm sorry, Bilam v'Aviv and his father, Eiv, Eliphaz HaTeimani, Ubaldat HaShuchsi, V'Tzayfer and Amasi, V'Aleo ben Barachel Habuzi. So Gemara says, well, so clearly Eiv was a non-Jew. So how can you say he left the exiles, and he came back to Tveria, and he had his study hall if he was a non-Jew? So Gemara says, no. Regardless, these 7 prophets, Eliyahu ben Bracha, Lav Yisrael Hava, Eliyahu ben Bracha was also Jewish. He came from the family of Ram. He was clearly Jewish. These 7 prophets weren't necessarily non-Jews, but they gave their prophecy for the non-Jews. That was their primary prophecy. So it could be that Eiv was Jewish. Gemara says, every one of the prophets spoke about the non-Jewish nations. Right? Famous prophecy of Jeremiah with the destruction of Tyre. Clearly destruction of a non-Jewish city inhabited by non-Jews. So Gemara says, the main prophecy of most of the prophets were for the Jews. These 7 prophets, their main prophecy was for non-Jews. There was a righteous man amongst the nations. His name was Eiv. He came to the world to get rewards for his suffering. God gave him difficulty, and he started being very upset with God. So God gave him a double reward in this world, so that he shouldn't get reward in the next world, according to this price. Okay, this price clearly indicates that Eiv was a non-Jew. So how can we say he's from the exiles and had a study hall in Tveria? So the Gemara says Tanoi. It's a debate amongst the Tanam. By the way, this price has clearly a very negative view of Eiv. We'll soon see that that's not universally the case. There are other opinions that say no, Eiv was a great righteous man. Tanoi, the Tanya we learned. Rabbi Elazar says Eiv lived at the time of the judges. Shenemar, as the verse states, Hein ata kulchem chazitem, v'loma zehevel tahavlo. This is a generation that's full of prophets. I'm sorry. No. Kulam chazitem. A chayzi here is somebody who sees. It could mean a prophet, but it could also mean someone who's sort of dreaming. Why is it that you're looking at things that are futile? When was a generation that was full of futilities? This was a generation of the judges. Rabbi Shua ben Karcha says, Eiv lived at the time of Achashverosh. You were not able to find prettier women than the daughters of Eiv. When was there a time where people were looking after pretty women? Where there was a major search for the prettiest women in the country. When did that happen? This was when Vashti died and Achashverosh set out to look for the prettiest women in the land. The aim of made David. Let's say he lived in the time of David. When David was old, they needed a woman to sort of massage him because he was always very cold. It's a punishment for David. And ultimately speaking, they got a woman for David so that if David wanted to marry her, he would have the option of marrying her. So they wanted her to be very pretty and attractive. David did not marry her so that she would have the opportunity to marry King Shlomo HaMelech. David didn't want. So basically, if David would marry her, she would not be able to marry Shlomo because that would be your father's wife, which is a prohibited relationship. And she was not able to marry anybody else because once she served the king, she was not allowed to marry anyone else. Okay. So they looked for a very pretty woman, although ultimately speaking, David did not marry her. They made David. They also looked for a pretty woman. So the Gemara says, there, in the time of David, they looked among all the Jewish people in Israel. But in the time of Achashverosh, it was throughout the entire world. Okay. Let's stop here.
That's cool.
Right there. Okay, tomorrow we talk a lot about job.